Hello from Sage and I. We are back with our read aloud. We miss you very, very, very much. Hope you're doing well. Today we are starting with Chapter 7, The Unshushables. Since Dave and Lindsay had been almost shouting at each other in the middle of the cafeteria, you might think that a lot of the other fifth graders in the room would have tuned in and paid attention to the commotion. You might think that a lot of the kids in the lunchroom already knew about the contest. But if you thought that, you'd be wrong. And you'd be wrong because you don't understand just how loud, how incredibly noisy it was in the cafeteria during fifth grade lunch. And not just on this one day. It was noisy during fifth grade lunch every day. And it wasn't noisy only at lunch. Anywhere a bunch of these fifth graders got together, the talking got out of hand. That's why it's time to tell you a little more about this particular set of fifth grade kids. Because there's more to tell. There's always more. A school system really is a little like the Army, remember? About how kindergarten is sort of like basic training camp? Because kindergarten was where Dave and the other new recruits first learned the rules. They learned when to sit and when to stand, when to talk and when to hush, when to walk and when to run, when to eat and nap and play and sing and draw and everything else. Because every system needs rules. No rules, no system. Most of the rules made perfect sense to Dave and the new recruits, especially rules like this. No fighting, no bullying, no shoving, no spitting, no biting, no stealing, no vandalism, no cutting in line, no snowball throwing, and so on. For most kids, the really serious rules like that weren't hard at all. Those were the easy ones. The toughest rules were ones like no running in the halls, hard. No disorderly behavior on the buses, also hard. No candy or chewing gum, very hard. But nowhere in the 44-page Laketon Elementary School handbook did it actually say no whispering, chatting, talking, calling out, yelling, or shouting in classrooms, in the hallways, in the auditorium, or in the lunchroom. True, there was a rule about paying attention in class, and there was a rule about being respectful, and there was a rule about being courteous at all times. And Dave and his classmates obeyed those rules. Or at least they thought they did. It's just that they all seemed to think that they could talk and be courteous at the same time. And they all seemed to think that they could talk and pay attention at the same time. Because none of these kids really meant to be disrespectful or disobedient or discourteous. But none of them wanted to stop talking. Ever. In fact, this group of kids had been given a nickname by the teachers at Laketon Elementary School, and the name had stuck with them ever since they had all been in first grade together. They were the Unshushables. If Laketon Elementary School had really been like the Army, then sometime, probably during second grade, Dave and Lindsay and all the other recruits would have been lined up out on the playground on a cold, rainy morning, and a gruff man with short hair and shiny shoes would have walked up and down in front of them, shouting right into their faces. And he would have shouted something like this: "You drive me crazy! You call yourselves students? You are a miserable mob. You are loud, undisciplined, and I will not tolerate your noise. When you walk in my hallways, you do not shout. You do not wave and yell and hoot when you see your friends. At an assembly in my school, you do not whisper and giggle and point and wave and laugh at your own silly jokes. And when you come to my lunchroom, it is not a free-for-all festival of flap-jawed jibber-jabber. Lunch is a time to sit and be quiet and eat. I am going to teach you little motor mouth monsters proper school manners if it is the last thing I do. Do I make myself clear? Yes, sir. Quieter. Yes, sir." But of course, Laketon Elementary School wasn't the Army. However, with Mrs. Abigail Hyatt in charge, sometimes it felt that way. She was a tall woman with a long face, curly gray hair, and bright blue eyes. And she had been the principal at Laketon Elementary School for the past 13 years. She gave careful orders, set precise goals, and she demanded results from her teachers, from her office staff, from her custodians, from her cafeteria workers, and from her students and their parents, too. Her school never went over its budget, never missed its academic targets, and the place never felt loose or sloppy or disorderly. Under Mrs. Hyatt's watchful eye, group after group of children had wandered into Laketon Elementary School as aimless little kindergartners and marched out 6 years later as perfectly disciplined young students. Under Mrs. Hyatt's leadership, the place ran like clockwork. And then the Unshushables came along. In all her years as a principal, she had never known a group of kids like this. And for the past 5 years, Mrs. Hyatt had been trying to make these kids obey the simplest school rule of all: no talking, except when it's allowed. Year after year, memos had been sent home to the parents of Dave and his classmates about too much shouting on the school buses. Year after year, Dave's grade had been told how to behave before every assembly. Year after year, all their teachers had stood out in the hallways to try to keep the noise down before and after school, especially at lunchtime. This group had even been given a separate lunch period for the past 3 years in a row: 3rd grade lunch, 4th grade lunch, and this year, 5th grade lunch. Mrs. Hyatt had made that decision. She didn't want the noisy behavior of this group to infect the other children at her school, because year after year, the Unshushables lived up to their nickname. To be honest, a few of this year's 5th grade teachers had already given up. They didn't have any real hope of changing these kids. They were just trying to cope, because it was already November, so in 6 short months, the Unshushables would be gone forever, moved along to the junior high, and next year Laketon Elementary School would be quieter, much quieter. But Mrs. Hyatt had not given up, not by a long shot. She still had over half a year with these kids, and she intended to use that time. Every day the principal stalked the 5th grade hall. "You there, stop shouting!" At every assembly she glared. "And I don't want to hear even a whisper from our 5th graders. Is that clear?" At every 5th grade lunch, she walked around the cafeteria with a big red plastic bullhorn, and when the noise became unbearable, she pulled the trigger and bellowed, "Students, you are talking too loud!" Mrs. Hyatt felt sure that this constant reminding had to be having an effect on these kids. How could it not? After all, these were good kids, right? They had to be making progress. Didn't they? She knew she was being very stern with them, but it was for their own good. And Mrs. Hyatt felt sure that sooner or later these kids would grow up a little and quiet down a lot. Here's a picture of her yelling into her megaphone during lunch. And now it's time to tell what happened in the middle of the second Tuesday in November during Dave Packer's final year at Laketon Elementary School. It was 2 minutes before 5th grade lunch, and the principal was ready, just like always. Mrs. Hyatt had checked to be sure that the other teacher who had 5th grade lunch duty wasn't out sick or at a meeting, because it wasn't good to try and manage 5th grade lunch all by herself. And just like always, she had ordered Mr. Lipton, the custodian, to stay in the cafeteria today until 12:40, because with this group, the more grown-ups around, the better. And Mrs. Hyatt had double-checked the batteries in her red plastic bullhorn, because it wasn't good to have a dead bullhorn during 5th grade lunch. Then the bell rang, and as classroom doors along the 5th grade hall flew open, Mrs. Hyatt could hear them coming, all of them, already calling to each other as locker doors clanged open and banged shut, already talking a mile a minute, already laughing and whooping and shouting, streaming down the hallway toward the cafeteria, an unshushable wave of energy and excitement and noise. So much noise. Mrs. Hyatt took her position at the center of the cafeteria and braced herself. She was ready for today's lunchroom battle, ready to change chaos into order, ready for anything that these kids could dish out. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. Now we're going to start Chapter 8, which is called Science Fiction. It was 4 minutes into the 5th grade lunch period, and Mrs. Hyatt was pretty sure that any second now her alarm clock was going to start making that awful sound. Because the principal was almost certain that she was still at home in her own comfy bed dreaming away. She had to be dreaming. But no, she looked at her watch and it showed the same time as the large clock above the stage in the school cafeteria, 12:04. On any other day, Mrs. Hyatt would have already used her bullhorn at least once, because when half the 5th graders were standing in the food line and the other half were in the milk line or rushing toward their seats, there was always a terrific burst of yelling and calling out and wild chatter, sort of like feeding time at the zoo. Not today. There was no talking at all, not one word. Over 125 children milling around the lunchroom and not a peep from any of them. Today the principal could hear the clattering of the worn-out motor in the milk cooler, and she could hear the kitchen workers talking softly to each other, and she could hear the children's feet on the tile floor shuffling along through the lines. The quiet almost frightened her. Mrs. Hyatt felt like she was in a scene from a creepy science fiction movie. She actually liked a good scary movie now and then, but she did not like the ideas in her mind at this moment, because it seemed like aliens had possessed these fifth graders and zapped their brains. Or maybe some strange creature had nipped off all their tongues, nothing left but little stubs that couldn't make a sound. The principal shivered. Then she noticed a girl staring at her. Mrs. Hyatt realized she must have had a strange look on her face. As the girl sat down with her lunch tray, Mrs. Hyatt forced herself to smile and said, "Hi there, Sheila. How are you today?" Her voice almost echoed in the quiet lunchroom. Every boy in the milk line turned and stared at Sheila. The girls turned and looked too. Sheila gulped, gave the principal a nervous smile, and speaking softly and slowly, she said, "Fine, thank you." Mrs. Hyatt turned toward the milk line, and all the kids looked away silently. And again, the principal felt like she was in the middle of a science fiction movie. It suddenly seemed silly to be standing there in a silent room with her huge red plastic bullhorn. So Mrs. Hyatt walked over to the playground door where Mrs. Escobar was standing. She tried to look as casual as possible. Tried to act like it was perfectly normal for the lunchroom to be stone silent except for the clattering of plates and the squeaking of sneakers on the waxed floor. The principal set the bullhorn on the floor by the wall and whispered to Mrs. Escobar, "What in the world is going on here?" Mrs. Escobar whispered back, "I have no idea, but it's something weird, that's for sure." Mrs. Hyatt did not like this feeling that something strange, something new was happening, because this new activity was happening at her school and no one had asked for her permission. This new activity was unauthorized. Mrs. Hyatt didn't simply like being in charge of her own school. She felt like she needed to be in charge. And that's why she felt like she had to say something, do something to break the spell. So she stepped away from the wall and in a loud voice she said, "Good afternoon, fifth graders. Are you enjoying your lunchtime today?" All the kids looked at each other. The whole room seemed to take a deep breath, and then almost everyone said, "Yes, Mrs. Hyatt," and then silence again. After an awkward few seconds, the principal said, "It's so quiet in here today. I'm very impressed with your good behavior." Some kids smiled, some nodded, but no one said a word. Mrs. Hyatt said, "Is there some special reason why no one's talking today?" The whole room went still. Even the chewing stopped. No hands went up, and no one answered her question. But Mrs. Hyatt was a keen observer, and in that sudden stillness, she noticed something. Right after she asked her question, it seemed like almost every boy looked at Dave Packer, who was standing beside the milk cooler, and it seemed like almost every girl took a quick look at Lindsay Burgess, who was just sitting down at a table. And the principal thought, that's odd. But the whole situation was odd, very odd, and now it seemed like the room was stuck in a complete calm, as if all the kids had even stopped breathing. Everyone was waiting to see what she was going to do next. And after a few more seconds of suspense, Mrs. Hyatt cleared her throat and said, "Well, students, please enjoy the rest of your lunchtime," and the cafeteria came back to life, silently. And the last chapter we're going to read is Chapter 9, The Right Word. As Dave sat down at a lunch table with his friends, he couldn't get the grin off his face. He was having so much fun he could hardly chew his first bite of grilled cheese. And he didn't like chewing right now because chewing made noise, and when he munched, he couldn't hear the silence. The silence. Dave thought it was amazing, and watching Mrs. Hyatt try to figure out what was going on, that was amazing too. It was like they had trapped her in a force field, and she couldn't get out of it because the silence filled the cafeteria. Dave looked around, and he saw the same amazement on the faces of some of the other kids. They were all thinking the same thing, together. Then suddenly, "Hey, give it back!" There was a gasp as every boy and girl in the room sucked in a breath, and all heads turned to see where those words had come from. And there at the ice cream freezer, Ed Kesey had one hand over his mouth while his other hand reached for a cherry popsicle that Brian Del Greco had grabbed. Dave swung around and looked at Lindsay. Lindsay knew a lot of kids were watching her, but she pretended not to notice. She slowly reached into her back pocket, slowly pulled out a pen and a small red notebook, slowly opened the cover, and slowly made 4 little marks on the first page. And as she flipped the notebook shut, Lindsay looked right at Dave and gave him a big smile. Just like that, and the girls were ahead by 4 points. But Dave wasn't worried. The contest had barely begun. There were 2 whole days to go. Dave was absolutely sure that the next 48 hours were going to be very interesting. And he thought, is that the right word? How about fascinating? No, more like exciting. Yeah, exciting. Then Dave happened to glance at Mrs. Hyatt, and he could tell from the look on the principal's face that she had been watching everything. The way Ed had shouted those words and then covered his mouth, the way all the other kids had reacted, the way Lindsay had marked her notebook. And at that exact moment, the principal turned and locked eyes with Dave. She stared right at him, with her eyebrows all bunched up in a puzzled knot. Dave quickly looked down at his lunch tray, and as he did, a new word popped into his mind, and he was pretty sure this one was also going to be a good word to describe the next few days. Dangerous. And that's where we're going to stop for today. I miss you so much, and I will see you next time. I love you all. And Sage says goodbye. She's currently lounging. See you guys later. I love you.